what I think that we might have to make this a two-parter because I haven't even gotten to the questions from Instagram, from folks where I made a post like, "Hey, I didn't say it was gonna be you, but I said, I'm gonna have a discussion with someone about proper cords." And I have some really good questions for you. However, the first one I have to ask you, and this might be the start of part two, can we talk about declared value? Because that is the hardest thing for any submission that I have, where PSA or anyone, but they're like, "Hey, take a guess as to what your card's gonna cost." And it's like I know there's a whole part of like insurance, and track. You have to make sure that if it gets lost, that you get paid a commensurate amount. But like, can we talk about declared value both in the sense of like me as a consumer having no clue what to declare my value as accurately, and then secondly, why does it cost more to create a card that has a higher declared value? I just don't get it. So I just want, help me understand it, Ryan.
It's a fantastic question, and definitely one I wasn't necessarily like prepped to answer, but I love it because I think that so if you like break that down to first principles, which I'm really big on, like why, right? And so like declared value, I was a sucker early on. I said I was big into grading, and like I was declaring everything. I was only submitting stuff that I thought was going to gem, right? And so
Mm,
I'm of course submitting things at a declared value of what I thought it would be if it sold as a gem, right?
yes.
And so sucker alert, right? Because I'm hitting 40, 50% gem rates and I'm overpaying for cards that are coming back much
Me,
worse graded than I anticipated, right?
me
And
too.
that's right, but that's what the process is asking you to do. So, if we sort of like take a step back, it's a flawed process. We should not have the burden of guessing. We of course think our cards are at the upper end of the spectrum of quality, right? And so we shouldn't have to pay a premium and then have the card reduced in value based off of something of a objective slash subjective opinion, and but yet we shoulder the burden of that. And so I think that's candidly pretty messed up and something that needs to be sort of reconsidered. That's just unfair to the consumer and leads to a bad experience. And I'm really big on how can we sort of remove friction in that, and that declared value is a huge piece of friction in the puzzle. And so I think that has to be reconsidered. And I think that's going to have to happen at like the PSA level or, whatever. Maybe actually one of the emerging companies does do that to sort of differentiate themselves. I'm big on like how do people differentiate themselves beyond price. And the
Right.
declared value part of that is really frustrating. To sort of spin that into the next set of questions you had there,
Yes.
I think it's it's difficult, number one, to do, and especially when things were so dynamic. 2 years ago, it was hard to even your declared value. I mean, like, look at all these suckers that me included. We sent in our cards that sat in, a warehouse for a year, where our declared
Mhm.
values were 5x what they were by the time they were graded. Right? There's no refunds being issued.
Mm,
Right? And that's what we
wow.
paid. That's what we declared, and so that's like that was a sucker move, and we all got. Um, I don't want to say, yeah, we all kind of got screwed by that
Snookered,
process, right?
snookered.
It just,
Yeah, we definitely
yeah,
got hoodwinked, or yeah, whatever you want to
yeah,
call it.
yeah, yeah,
Companies
yeah.
are all
Hoodwinked was
that
where I
way.
was going.
Yeah.
Hoodwinked was where I was going, but then it was definitely aging me. But yes, that's where I was going. Um, so I think that's a really frustrating part of the process that again needs to be reconsidered. But you can make the argument why it exists is it's for insurance purposes, right? And like
Right.
the why do slabs get a premium again? Like first principles, like why does certain slabs get a premium? Like people are placing a bet on like the longevity of a slab, right? Like is
Mm,
this slab going to mean something in the market? And so PSA's brand means something. They invest a lot in brand. There's a premium that gets sort of ascribed to their brand and to their slabs, and that's why you'll see the premium sort of grew over time. At the same time, Beckett was really like not very vocal in the market. There wasn't a lot of people were losing faith in it because Beckett was not necessarily like the most operationally sound company at the sort of height of the pandemic. They were sort of status quo, and that sort of led to just things moving really slowly on their end, and they weren't really communicating what was happening there. So I think in that process, you had one company sort of emerging where there was just like a really easy scale to follow. There was a brand that people understood to be around and that they could bet on, and there was also another brand that people did trust that sort of like really wasn't communicating and was really just sort of like not really servicing the hobby very well when things were sort of getting a lot of attention, it had a lot of momentum. And then at the same time, you had somebody like SGC emerging as like a second option that people really started to gravitate towards. Beyond that, though, you have this this declared value part of the equation, which is like you
mm,
pay a premium because PSA is willing to sort of like say we're going to insure your card up to a certain degree if something happens to it. If we overgrade it and there's a transaction in the market, if something happens to the card in the grading process, we're willing to reimburse you, right? Like they're willing to do that up to a degree if certain standards or certain circumstances are met. They're one of the only ones that really does that and sort of puts a price on it. And so,
Mm,
declared value to some degree means something similar at the other companies, but not to the same degree. And I'm not really sure even that it's like the language is as strong or that they will sort of make good on it to the degree that
yeah.
PSA will. But that's another reason like PSA gets a premium is that you pay more for it up front. You have to put this declared value on it, but that's why you pay more for the cards in the secondary market as well because
Mm,
that's baked into it to some degree. So, anyways, declared value has a role, but it really should not be on us to sort of have to pay up front and get hoodwinked when your cards are sitting in a warehouse or the values change or it just doesn't grade as well as you thought. Of course, like we don't
right.
know how it's going to grade, and so to have to sort of make that, there has to be a better sort of like conversation around how we actually accurately price these cards and how you sort of how your charge reflects that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Are you an Office fan, by the way?
I was early on. I didn't watch the latter
Early on?
seasons, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah, no, same here. But I remember this one. I don't know what episode number and all that, but I remember early on, Steve Carell or Michael Scott. He just goes, "I declare bankruptcy." So every time I do a declared value submission in my head, it's just Michael Scott just being like he's declaring bankruptcy by yelling it in the office. So yes, I declare yeah values and I always I always over declare. It's like I think my cards are pretty. What I mean, unless there are cards from the 90s where I know that it's maybe an 8 or a 9 and I just want to have it in a holder. I think my cards are beautiful and they're all gems, like no, but
Yeah.
what you said just now is just so wonderful and I feel like I'm definitely not getting PSA sponsorship money, but or a grader, or I asked all the grading companies if they could have a grader come on. I feel like PSA might not say it, not that they might ever would have, because when you're the big dog in the company in the industry, you don't have to communicate with people, or you don't have to do anything. Like you're the clubhouse leader. Like what are you gonna do? Like you're number one. So anyway, but if they were smart, they would come on to the fastest growing sports card network podcast in the hobby. So I just have a feeling. I have nothing confirmed, but given their hobby media presence, with SGC Pete, with SGC, and like Jason Coons with ISA, and some good communication with CGC. I have a really strong feeling that I'm going to be able to get one or two graders to talk about the grading, how it is on their end, to just kind of like humanize graders, because that's what this whole thing is about. This whole podcast. Um, but no, your insight is like, oh my goodness, like my I am completely loving this, and I hope the listeners are as well. Um, so should I just move on to the next question, or did you want to say something to what I just said? Just
No,
giving a
it's
praise.
not. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that, but also just to close the loop on that, like, it's not a shot at the companies by any
Yeah.
means. Like what I just sort of went through, it's just like the process is flawed and it needs to sort. These were inherited processes, right? Like
Mm,
PSA/collectors was acquired a few years ago. This process has been in place for a long time, and so I just think it needs to sort of be reconsidered. And there's sort of like the symptom of that is we all understate our declared value, and then you have this Mahomes incident where like Mahomes was
mm,
sort of damaged in sort of the process of grading and declared value was like far under what the person actually thought it was valued at because it was a good
mm.
condition card and like it just leads to like these bad symptoms. And so we need to sort of get more to the root cause of like it really shouldn't be us taking a guess based off of like cards and people having sort of different expectations. Like grading is really ultimately all about like expectations and sort of like um consistency, and like that's one of the most inconsistent parts of the process at this stage.
Man, isn't that life? But yeah, you're so right. Early on, what I would do with my declared value, of course, I was like, here's how conspiracy theory I got. And this is one of my first submissions, and this was like in December of last year. I was like, all right, man, like, or okay, all right, Danny. Here's the thing. All right, if you underdeclare, they're gonna give you like an 8 or a 9. You gotta declare it like a 10 so that they treat it like a 10. But if you underdeclare, they're gonna be like, oh, he doesn't think his card is gonna be a 10, so why don't I just give it an 8 or a 9? And it's like, no, like now that I know how the process works with like handing cards off, and I don't think, and maybe I'll ask a grader, but I don't think the graders know what your declared value was.
Yeah, no, that's exactly. I'm always. I still did it. I did those submissions I just talked about at the national, and of course, I'm one of these persons that's putting like a lower grade card in front of a better grade card because I want the next card to look better, right? And like these are
Yes.
humans. As long as there's humans involved, I'm gonna sort of like factor in the psychology of like how
Mm,
people are gonna react, right? And so yes, of course, like maybe they're not seeing the name, maybe they're not seeing the declared value, maybe they are. I don't really know. They say they're not, but it's like who knows how sort of like walled these data sets are, right? And so anyways,
right.
it's just like, yes, I did the same thing, and I'm like, of course I'm going to put this as a PSA 10 because they're going to treat it, as if it's a PSA 10, and like they know that I'm willing to sort of like I took that bet and I put my money where my mouth is and paid for a
Right.
PSA 10. So like if it's on the margins, like they're like, oh, I don't know, 9 or 10 coin flip. I'm like, no, I'll go 10. And so that was sort of like my mentality, but it added up and me losing enough from like screw it, I'm going low end and I'm just going to place the bet that I'll just submit everything the way everybody else does and stop making that bet because it just was too expensive.
Right. Well, here's the thing. For someone as smart as you to have the same thoughts as me as myself makes me feel so good that even someone really smart can just be like a little bit like the human psychology of things. But I, you did not know this, but I mean, I alluded to the questions from Instagram, but I mean, that was a great segue into the questions from Instagram. And this is almost like the first time I'm doing this type of like, it's not a segment, but like, I was like, you know what? I know I have this interview coming up. I felt ready for it. We're already at an hour, but I would love to kind of get the community kind of to ask questions because I don't have all the questions. I don't have all the answers. And I thought, just reach out and let's see how it goes. So I have some great questions if it's okay with you. I have about maybe like six. You can go fast, you can go slow. Again, this is going to be two parts because I'm just loving everything you're saying, and you're such a good sport about all of this. So the questions kind of center around cost, profits, technology future, and then crossover, crack, resub. So
Cool.
you do not speak for any of these companies. You are someone who graded, and then your hobby business is collating and sharing this information in digestible packages. So is it okay if we start with this line of questions?
Yeah, no, let's do it. And I'll try to keep these answers shorter. And to your point, like I don't have like a lot of insider information here. I do talk to the grading companies, but like I don't
Yeah,
know the processes that well. Like I've never
right.
been behind the scenes. I don't know the ins and outs of the grading. Do know sort of like I can contextualize pop reports a little bit, but I don't know the ins and outs. That said, I do my own research, and so to the
Yeah.
degree that I can answer, I'll do it for sure.
All right, awesome. So I'm gonna start with Mac from Virginia, and I guess I'm gonna combine the two questions. Mac from Virginia and Josh from Colorado both basically ask about AI grading versus human grading. So the Frankenstein monstered questions, because of course Dr. Frankenstein was the actual doctor, not the actual monster, folks. Come on, let's get it clear. Um, how d- how do you ensure consistency across graders within a grading company? I suppose. How do you ensure consistency across graders? And do you foresee a day where these companies are more reliant on technology for grading, such as with AI? So the general question is, what are your thoughts with AI grading, human grading, consistency? We just talked about the bad days and putting a bad card in front of a good card. So we're almost like trying to outthink the grader. So what are your thoughts on AI grading and human grading?
Yeah, so I did just hear a great interview from Nat Turner a week and a half ago or whatever. It was on a Pokemon channel. It's really good. If you want to get a little bit more into the weeds, that's a really really good listen. But Nat basically speaks to like tech enabled grading, and I do think that's where it's going. So I think like I do like what Tag is doing. I liked when HGA was giving their spiel in the sense of like I do like the idea of there being more technology infused in the process because look, the reason all these things we say about the graders resonates is because we do it ourselves. Like we all know that we have bad days, that we sort of have certain days that like we're performing stronger than others, or like it's 5:15 and we're trying to get out the door. It's the end of the day and we're just doing things a little bit quicker, and things aren't getting the full process that maybe they should, and so or the full treatment that they should, and so we all kind of know where corners get cut, and we get sort of worried that we're sort of the victim of that, and so it resonates, right? And
Yeah.
so to the degree that tech enabled grading just allows that process to be a little bit more consistent, a little smoother, and sort of like reduces the burden that every card is sort of like looked at from zero and just gives you like a running start instead of, um, again, from zero, having to sort of understand like the context of this card. So being able as a grader to be handed context and then sort of looking at, I wanted to say intangibles, but it is tangible. The look, the feel, like these things matter. And so being able to handle, it's almost like having a resume of the card, but then like being able to sort of like assess it and sort of like get to know the ins and outs of it a little bit better. And like that matters. And so I do think we're going to get to this point where like technology like one, it's not gonna enter the equation unless there's like a savings and synergies for these companies, right? So they're not going to spend unless it sort of like reduces the cost to some degree, whether that's in the short term or the long run. Like there has to be a benefit to the companies
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of ways. Some of these companies may be a little bit more brand focused and might be placing just a bigger bet on like, look, we're doing it right and we're playing a 5 to 10 year game, and so we'll introduce tech at a loss. But
Yeah.
usually there's a financial piece of this where it has to sort of like build on, okay, we can sort of like reduce staff to some degree, or we can be less reliant on staff in some ways.
Mm-hmm.
So I do think there has to be some sort of like efficiencies introduced, but I do think tech's going to enter the equation. And I do think it's good. I think like the biggest thing is like, we all want strong grades. We all want, grades that are fair. I think we want strong grades first and grades that are fair second. But I think most important is we need consistency. So like I look at these gem rates all the time, and I said like I sort of like parse my submissions based off of like where I think cards are going to grade better at certain places than others. And it's partially because like there's just different interpretations of these different grading scales. And so, there's always going to be, AI is never going to make it so that like one company has the exact same scale as another company. There's always going to be sort of like different levers that they sort of dial up or dial down based off of like their history, their legacy, and sort of like how they sort of establish themselves. And so it's not like all cards are going to, if you send one card in, you're going to get the same card. If you send one card into a grading company A and it gets a certain grade based off of their standards, you send it into grading company B, it's going to get the exact same grade because their standards will be different. Like the levers that they pull and sort of like the dials that they turn are going to look a little bit different. So I don't think it like levels the playing field so much that like grading doesn't matter, or like grading becomes like, I don't know, such a commodity that there's no differentiation between the companies. So I think
Okay.
that's the first part of it, and I definitely think it adds a lot of efficiency. Like you should know centering when a card gets handed off to you. Like it seems kind of crazy to think that we have to start from scratch. And again, this comes down to the manufacturers not like
Right.
handing off a lot of great data, right? Like there isn't a history of how the centering should look. They don't have a lot of examples to sort of
Mm.
reference, and so there's definitely like a learning curve for a lot of these sets, a lot of these cards. But at the end of the day, I still think you do need humans to sort of like put the final stamp of approval to do sort of like
Mm.
I called it like the interview phase of the card, but like you're really
Yeah.
just sort of like looking over the intangibles and the nuances and just like being able to evaluate like, does it check out, and then like what are the things that I know, sort of the institutional knowledge as it relates to certain cards, certain sets, certain sort of whatever that plays into it. You still need like that final approval to come from a human in my mind. Um, or at least like I think it's a good thing to have. I don't know that you have to have it. Say, for example, Tag doesn't go that route. Tag only
Yeah.
does,
Right.
you know, uh, technology
Yeah.
grade based grading. I think that's fine, but that's just you kind of know what you are dealing with there, and like there's certain
Right.
trade offs that are being made as a result of that.
I'm still trying to learn about Arena Club, but I feel like they also have AI assisted, but I think it is a combination of both. But again, I'm not like trying to do say one is better than the other, but I know that their staff was very nice and their lines were not very overly long. But I'm gonna put a pin on those words, resume and interview, because I have a great question from someone coming in the pipeline. But I just want to say I thought about making content where it's like PSA is like the cool teacher, and like these other grading companies are like the tougher teachers, where it's like, it's almost like we want our cards to gem. And I'm not saying that PSA does a bad job of it, but we know that, a PSA 10 is different from a pristine 10 and a gold label 10 from BGS. And I almost feel like we're just like, hey teacher, like, can you like me? Can you tell me my grades are good? And you got like this super strict teacher. BGS is like, no, it's like this like German chancellor woman who's like, no, nine, I cannot like your cards. You will never make me laugh and like all this stuff. And then there's like that cool teacher in the back who's like, yeah, you get an A. It's all good. Hey, have a good summer.
Hmm.
And it's like, I don't know. I think we all like cool teachers. I like cool teachers, but I don't know if you learn. I don't know if you learn a lot of stuff.
No, it is. It's a good. I think it's a good analog. I mean, look, I
All
think
right.
that is part of the challenge. Is it does sort of like people want to maximize their value, right? And so, like, I'll try to keep this spiel short, but I've never
Mhm.
really shared this. But I think like subgrades are like an interesting part of this process, and like the one thing that AI is going to bring is like more transparency and accountability, which I think is important, right? Like, I actually think subgrades are like really misunderstood in their value prop to the industry. Like, I think subgrades matter a ton as a submitter, to just know like, okay, did I sort of like read the room well? Did I read the card well? Did I like get a sense for like, okay, this is what I'm dealing with, right? And it's
Totally.
sort of like comforting to know like, okay, I'm good or bad at my job, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like that's where the service is. But then at that point, when you sort of like get past like, okay, there's some accountability there, it's like it becomes a little bit harder to move because then it's like, how do you value subgrades versus how do I value subgrades, right? And so subgrades
Hmm.
are actually like not as productive from a selling standpoint always, and like harder from a buyer standpoint because it adds friction. Like you and I have to agree on sort of like
Yeah.
how we value subgrades, and that's one of the reasons that PSA simple scale has really resonated. And like Beckett did themselves a disservice, being a price guide. Like never really Beckett should have invented a price guide that was really laser focused on like helping people value the ins and outs of subgrades. Like everything that's on the margins, Beckett should have done like a price guide that really sort of just like help people understand like this is how we grade and this is what
Hmm.
it looks like a true gem looks like and this is what a gem plus looks like and a gem plus
Hmm.
plus and all these
Yeah.
different things, right? Like that would have been something that I think would have been really well received. They just weren't really like focused on that part of the process.
Yeah.
But subgrades add a lot of friction. So AI, I think, is really interesting, and I think it's going to add a lot of accountability, which is something
Mm.
that's severely lacking, right? And so I do think it's going to help people sort of just like again rationalize the grade and sort of understand like okay, like again, this is what I'm dealing with. This is what I'll sort of change my process next time.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I think we have this sort of like challenge if people do like the cool teacher and want the grade that's going to sort of like get them to the next level, right? That helps you graduate or sort of maximize your portfolio. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
that's all we want to do is sort of like make money. That said, there's a lot of like pockets of this hobby that do care about like a lot of these fringe things. Like I grade a lot of Obsidian that grades really poorly. And like that's
Hmm.
part of why I went to 4 different grading companies is like there's certain ways I want them to evaluate these cards and there's certain slab
Mm.
or certain cards that mean different things to me in that submission. Um, the yeah, anyways, I can keep going, but I just think like subgrades are really interesting and like misunderstood. Like I actually think they do a disservice. People think that they add value to the process, and I think they're good for accountability, but I think they're actually bad from a transactional standpoint in most instances.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, from a transactional standpoint, I think as a collector, and I think collectors really like BGS because the whole House Iron days of Beckett and Dr. Beckett and all that. But as a collector, I think information is power. Like, I I was as you were talking, I was thinking about another piece of content because I'm always thinking content. Um, it's like that Backstreet song, with subgrades. Like, at least they tell me why. And like PSA, I got this beautiful Kobe refractor, and I just want to be like, tell me why. Ain't nothing but a Gen
Oh my
10.
god, I can't believe you were able to weave that in, but man, does that hit home?
You know, eh, I'm not. I come from humble beginnings, Ryan. But not all heroes wear capes. Okay, so all right, enough of that. My wife keeps saying people need to stop saying you're so good on Instagram because you're not going to be able to fit into these hats, and she might be right about that. I don't know. We'll see.
Oh my
I
god.
think I might just be like the new bright shiny object, and things will dissipate
You
soon.
you might have just, and I'll have to ask you for permission to borrow that, but I think the Tell Me Why might make its way onto some Gem Rate swag. We've been launching or sort of introducing some swag, but Tell Me Why is that's a good bit. Yeah, I will source you on it if that's the
Yes,
case. But
yes,
I've been
yes.
trying to think of like, look, I don't want to do anything that's like so corny, like Pop One or anything like that. That's sort of like obviously people sort of like that think of when they think of like Gem Rate and different pop reports and stuff like that. But Tell Me Why, I like that. That's a bit deeper. That means something.
Look, I think the people who know me the most know that I am only in this hobby for the money and the royalties and the passive income. I actually don't like cards. I am like, watch someone clip this. Watch as I get bigger, some of these watchdogs or whatever, they're gonna be like, oh look, I can clip this. I It's yours to run with. Enjoy it. I can't wait. I will be can I the only thing I'll ask is can I please be the first purchaser of one of those shirts? So that's all I'll say.
100%. And you missed a good opportunity to bring your Simmons in. He loves to talk about the aggregators. You
Oh,
missed it. You had
yeah.
that teed up for you.
Well, let me tell you how all these grading companies, they're kind of like the five levels of the Sopranos. You kind of got Tony up there. He's kind of like the PSA, right? But then this other family, they want to come around, and we're not ready for that. No, we're not. All right, I'm done. I'm done. I had nowhere to go. We're just riffing here. Other podcast hosts would be much more tighter with their information, but you know what? I'm gonna do it the way I want to do it. And thank you for
This is
obliging.
why
You
this
yeah.
is this is why I'm here. I'm here
This is why
because
I'm
of that.
here.
I'm not here for
Yeah.
the questions. I'm here for the in between.
Yes, the in between. But look, I do have to ask these questions. I think they're gonna be some really funny ones. I got man, the resume and interview one is gonna be great. Okay, here we go. Um, we were just talking about finances, right? So I wanted to ask you, or G from California, who actually was like, you have to send me Instagram handle. So Lucky Show 5, shout out to you. Hope you're listening. You better be listening. How long does it take for these newer grading companies to be profitable? And I think he asked that because he didn't know that it was going to be someone like you. But do you, I mean, we're talking about these emerging and the tier two and all this stuff. Like, clearly it is profitable. The second extension to that question is from Alex from Virginia. Do you know what it actually costs to grade a card? And I'll add to that, like how long, we can later. The follow up question can be how long does it take to grade a card? Not just the queue and backup. Like, does it take a minute? Does it take 2 minutes? But like, I understand you're not going to be able to answer this for every company, but based on your vantage point, how long does it take for these newer grading companies to be profitable? How long, what does it actually cost to grade a card? The labor and materials components.
Yeah. So good question. This definitely channels more of my like finance background, and I do think it's interesting to think about. Like when I invested in collector's stock, back in 2020, I definitely was sort of thinking about like how was this company being perceived, and it was very much perceived as like a value stock, a dividend paying value stock, which is like, they're generating cash and they're paying it off to investors, right? Which is like um, it's like investing in like a 1990s refractor of Ken Griffey Jr., right? He's retired. It's kind of going to continue to sort of move up over time. Honestly, that's probably giving too much credit to like what these value stocks mean. But it's like it's predictable to some degree, and that company was sort of they were getting a lot of pressure from like activists at the time because they were like, you're sitting on this sort of like market expansion opportunity, and you're really not like pushing enough. You're not really introducing technology. You're sitting on a backlog, and that's when Nat and his team stepped in and were like, we're going to actually like sort of change the incentives here. And we're going to sort of change the shape of this company. We're going to take it private. We're going to sort of like rebuild it as a tech company. We're going to sort of take on losses. I don't know that they're taking on losses. I'm just making that up, but I'm just saying like, we're going to do things a bit different. We're going to invest in the brand. So that the setup for that is like that collector's company was an order of magnitude smaller. They were doing like, I can't remember the exact numbers. I think it was like 30 million in annual revenue off of card grading. They also had coin grading, which was a larger business for them at that time. Coin grading was a larger business for collectors 4 years ago. And so it's like crazy to think about where things were and where they are now. But that was, I don't know their exact financials, but again, I think they were profitable at that stage. I'm not 100% sure that's the case, but if they're paying dividends, they must have been. At least that's how I was thinking about it. And with now they're a few hundred million on the grading side, right? If you just sort of do the numbers of like what GemRate's publishing, they're going to do 12 million cards at I don't know, $20 on average. Like they're doing hundreds of millions here, and so they've 10x that, right? So they're extremely profitable. This is a cash cow. They put a lot, at the same time they've 5-10x their org to support that. So it's not like it's immediately flowing through to the bottom line. They've put resources. They've done a lot in investing in technology. They've done a lot to invest in team. They've turned over a lot of staff. They removed a lot of the people that were there during sort of the dividend paying days of the company and brought in people who are a little bit more like technology oriented and a little bit more accustomed to like moving at a growth and startup pace. And so that's important context, just in the sense of like, that company was really small and profitable. And so why I say that is you can be really small and profitable and not be the number one player in the industry and have a lot of success. And so if you think about like where SGC was and where SGC is today, they're maybe like half of what PSA was at that time that they were public. Maybe they're a third of that. I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but they're probably running like they were not a very big operation. They've since expanded their grading team. They've done more to sort of like invest in service and things like that, but it's not like they've revamped their technology and revamped all these different things where they're sort of eating costs left and right. And so you can be a number 2 and a number 3 in this industry and still make a lot of money. And so that's why you see all this, like all these people that are frustrated with like, why aren't other companies keeping up with PSA? And it's, well, they're not really incentivized. My big thing is like, if you actually looked at like how these companies comp their employees or how they're sort of incentivized, meaning like just their corporate structure. So like PSA is a private company that will probably go public again. I'm saying PSA, I mean Collectors Universe as a whole, will probably go public again at some point in the future. Like they're incentivized to go back into the public markets at a multiple of where they went private, right? So they're in the, we're betting on the market growing, we're betting that we can do big things better. They're in that boat. They're in that camp. They're similar to Fanatics. They don't necessarily believe it's going to 10x, but they need the market to grow. They need to grow themselves. Whereas like SGC, they're probably like, hey, let's just do things right. Let's not sort of get ahead of ourselves and take on too many costs while we're growing the revenue side of this business. But like, we don't need to be doing 10 million cards a year to be sitting pretty and sort of make ourselves look, interesting from an acquisition standpoint or potentially whatever. I mean, they may be happy just sort of being private for a long time and paying off cash to investors, but they don't have to be a massive company to be really productive. And the whole flip side of that, though, is Beckett, which is owned by private equity, which I'm not going to make the exact comparison I make.
Don't get in trouble, Ryan. Don't get in trouble.
But they're basically, they're not incentivized to push the envelope a ton, right? Like they are a company that has sister companies and it's a portfolio of companies that was, generating a lot of cash. And I'm guessing the incentive structure was more around the lines of ride the wave and don't break things. And like, that's kind of what you saw, which is like, we're not necessarily needing to sort of like take off and ride this wave into a new sort of paradigm and sort of like change the trajectory of this company. It's like, let's do what we're supposed to be doing, because again, it's a corporate structure that's very different. You don't hear a lot about who owns Beckett. You don't hear a lot about who, is the board of Beckett and how they think about sort of like the big picture, right? You just don't hear a lot of conversations around that. And so the reality is they probably are sort of okay with where things are. And that's frustrating to a lot of people because they want Beckett to evolve. They want the company to change. And I think there's been momentum towards that, but it's like what PSA did 3 years ago, and they're doing it like less aggressively in a lot of ways. Like PSA realized like, okay, we need to turn over a lot of the team. We need to change the mindset of what we're doing here. Where Beckett's kind of like, we're going to sort of like steer into the next generation of like where this hobby's going, but we're going to sort of like do it sort of like slowly while we're sort of trying to keep people happy with like all the way that things used to look. And it's really hard to do that. It's really hard to sort of like steer into the future and keep everybody happy, and also sort of like make sure the incentives are there, that people want to work harder and people want to like take on more risk and be willing to break things. And so my point with that is just like these companies, I think, all do pretty well. But they all sort of have different motivations and different incentives. And it starts at the top. It starts at like, what game are they playing? It's a question I ask all the time. Is like, what game are they playing? And like PSA is playing a go public game. SGC is playing like a we're private and we're sort of like throwing out cash and like how big can we get game? But they're doing it like in a pretty strategic way. CGC is owned by Blackstone. They're private equity. They're owned by like a lot of bigger name players in the space. Like they're incentivized to grow at a pretty fast pace. They have a portfolio of companies that they consider when they're considering like where they fit into the mix. And so everybody's sort of playing these games. And so sorry for the long-winded setup there, but it's really important to know like the context of like what game everybody's playing, because I think they're all pretty productive. The newer companies, to the heart of the question, is like, and I have one other data point on just like the unit economics of this, but it's like, I don't know that they have to be doing, there's a certain scale you have to get to obviously be profitable. I don't know what that is. Like, I don't know how quickly a tag's profitable versus like an arena, but because they're introducing tech sooner in the process, they probably made a bigger upfront investment. They probably can do more with less though, from a staff standpoint. So it's kind of like, but they probably have to hit some threshold of cards to sort of like hit break even. That's probably pretty far out in the sense of like, I do feel like they probably invested a bit in tech and a bit in like the upfront development. The R&D upfront is probably pretty heavy, but once they hit this point of leverage, it's probably pretty meaningful for them, and that they don't need to add as nearly as much staff as like a PSA might have had to, or a Beckett would have to at this stage. The last point of that is just like, how much does it cost to grade a card? I mean, you can see online like what the grading companies pay individuals in this space, and I'm sort of shocked by it sometimes, just because like I think we think these are like a couple $100,000 a year jobs where people are, experts in their industry. And, if you look at like the entry-level jobs for PSA or mid-tier jobs for PSA for a grader, it's entry-level $17 an hour. The, mid-tier grading or, not necessarily entry-level grader gets paid $20 to $35 an hour. And if you do the math, let's just say we say it's $30 an hour. And I think the grading company, sorry, I'm throwing out so many numbers here, but like they're doing $30 an hour and they're doing 60 cards. They're doing a card a minute, right? It's about 50 cents a card graded from a human standpoint, from a human investment standpoint, human cost standpoint. So I think, it's pretty cheap. And nobody really, if you listen to any interviews, is saying that these cards are getting like a deep look. It's probably vintage that takes a little bit longer, and they're probably like also paying that staff more. So the cost to grade a vintage card is probably like $5 per grade per card, right? Versus
Yeah.
like an ultra modern card is probably like a quarter relative to like how
Wow.
much time they spend, right? And so, but we're paying $15, we're paying $10. That's why SGC can do these specials at $9 and still actually make money because there's obviously the cost of the plastic and all the other parts of the process, which is the research teams, the operations team, shipping. Although you usually pay shipping, but anyways,
That's right. Yeah, we bear the brunt of that too.
I mean, but the last data point I'll mention is this PSA. When I mentioned where they were in 2019 when they were private, their average price of a card graded, or the average cost of a card graded, meaning like what you paid as a consumer, was $9. And I think they were a profitable company. So you can get to $9 and be profitable in this space. So that's why there's a lot of talk about like race to the bottom, and why I don't think pricing is a big differentiator, because in the long run I do think like $10 to $15 is going to be the standard for most cards that go through the doors. And so it's a lot of like, how do you add value beyond pricing? But to G's question, it's not that expensive to sort of like evaluate a card, and I don't think that much time goes towards evaluating the card as we think or sort of imagined.
I'm eating this up. I hope the listeners are too. Whoever thinks this is too much numbers, you might just not be the right audience for this podcast, because you're probably just like, just give me how much is my slab worth. This is awesome. Thank you so much. You broke it down. I